Tracks of Dispossession, Indigenous Lands, and the Making of the CPR by Strikey Roy. Preface. When I began this project, I thought I was following tracks. I imagined a history that moved along the steel lines of the Canadian Pacific Railway, a story of engineers, financiers, and political ambitions. What I found instead was a network of much older paths, stories, and obligations. Those paths did not disappear when the rails came through. They were crossed, constrained, and in many cases violently reconfigured. Tracks of Dispossession grew out of the desire to follow those crossings, to listen to the people and documents that have too often been left off the map of the railway story. My own path to this book was not straight. I am neither an Indigenous elder nor a lawyer. I came to this topic as a historian and a listener, frustrated by how standard histories of the CPR tidy over uncomfortable truths. Early on, I realized that to understand the railway fully, I needed to place Indigenous perspectives at the center. That meant spending long hours in archives, yes, but also sitting in living rooms, at community centers, and on treaty lands, listening carefully to oral histories. Those conversations were the most humbling part of the work. People shared memories, songs, and family stories, and they did so with patience and with hope that those memories would be treated with care. Research for this book brought together several kinds of evidence. Treaty texts and government correspondence show the legal language and promises that were made. Missionary letters and settler diaries reveal the attitudes and assumptions of the time. Indigenous oral histories provide a counterpoint, a continuity of meaning that is not always visible in written sources. Modern legal analysis helps explain how treaties were interpreted and enforced, and how gaps between promise and practice were created and sustained. Each source has its limitations, and part of this book's work is to place those limitations in plain view, to be transparent about what the archives do and do not tell us. There were challenges that I did not fully anticipate. Archival silence is one. Important voices are simply absent from official records. Another challenge was the ethical responsibility of relating stories that can reopen old wounds. I sought guidance from community members and scholars, and I tried to follow their directions about what could be shared and how. Consent and reciprocity were guiding principles, not afterthoughts. I also wrestled with legal complexity. Treaty language can be dense, and court decisions are not always easy to translate for general readers. I have aimed to explain legal ideas in plain language while respecting the complexity of the law and the lived realities it shapes. Along the way, I encountered moments of surprising clarity. A missionary's letter that casually recorded a forced negotiation, a treaty document annotated in a way that revealed the expectations of government officials, an elder's account of a tree line that marked a boundary long before the surveyors arrived. These discoveries are not isolated curiosities. Together they trace a pattern, one in which railway expansion operated as a mechanism of dispossession, and one in which Indigenous communities responded with resilience, negotiation, and resistance. I came to understand the CPR not simply as a feat of engineering or an act of national imagination, but as a driver of colonial transformation with long-lasting consequences. Writing this book changed how I think about history and about responsibility. History is not only about explaining the past, it is also about sharing obligations in the present. What matters for readers is not only the facts of dispossession, but the ways those facts continue to shape land, law, and life today. For students and teachers, this book aims to offer a framework for centering Indigenous agency in discussions of infrastructure and state building. For policymakers and journalists, it provides historical context that can inform debates about land rights, reconciliation, and repair. For Indigenous readers, my hope is that the book reflects care for stories shared with me and contributes to ongoing conversations about memory and justice. If there is one thing I hope you take from these pages, it is that centering Indigenous perspectives changes everything. It reshapes what counts as the main story, and it insists that treaty promises, legal processes, and everyday acts of survival be treated as central, not peripheral. The railway was a tool of expansion, but it also intersected with existing sovereignties, obligations, and relationships. Recognizing that complexity is not an academic exercise, It is a step toward understanding how past decisions continue to matter and how better decisions might be made today. Thank you for taking the time to read this book. Thank you to the many people who shared their knowledge, corrected my assumptions, and trusted me with difficult memories. I hope these pages are useful, challenging, and respectful of the lives they describe. Strikey Roy for House Panther, whose courage, stories, and unwavering generosity made Tracks of Dispossession possible. With deep gratitude for your guidance, your warmth, and the trust you placed in this work. Chapter 1, Tracks of Arrival, Railways, Empire, and Colonial Logic. 9 out of 10 lands along the first transcontinental lines were claimed, surveyed, or otherwise reclassified within a decade of track laying. That figure does not come from a railway company ledger, but from land office records, mission correspondence, and indigenous testimony compiled across decades. It signals something fundamental. Railways did more than move freight and people. They reordered the map of authority, law, and daily life, making the distant interior legible to imperial power and vulnerable to dispossession. This chapter examines how railways functioned as instruments of imperial control and settlement. I trace the technical, legal, and rhetorical tools that painted rail lines as neutral engines of progress while they operated as mechanisms of state expansion. Engineers, surveyors, and politicians worked alongside constables, missionaries, and real estate promoters to convert track laying into territorial claim. The iron rails became measuring rods for property, jurisdiction, and sovereignty. Their placement decided which communities would be circled into treaty processes, which would be bypassed, and which would be compelled to adapt or move. Evidence comes from many sources. Government orders and treaty text reveal legal strategies for tying indigenous land to railway access and agricultural settlement. Missionary letters show how religious intermediaries framed rail access as a path to salvation and civilization. Oral histories record the immediate, lived responses to trains, from curiosity and welcome to alarm, grief, and organized resistance. Together, these voices show a pattern. Railways catalyzed new forms of interaction between indigenous nations and imperial institutions, often on terms set by the latter. I also examine the language used to describe the tracks. Promises of connectivity, development, and national unity were repeated in parliamentary debates, newspaper editorials, and promotional pamphlets. Those promises carried weight, but they also masked legal maneuvers that transferred land and imposed settlement patterns. Where treaties were negotiated, railways were routinely invoked as justification for altering land use and extinguishing indigenous tenure. When treaties were not secured, construction and settlement still advanced the same aims through de facto occupation. Finally, this chapter considers indigenous agency amid these pressures. Communities negotiated terms, created parallel economies, and sometimes won limited accommodations. Resistance took many forms, including legal challenges, petitions, direct action, and strategic engagement with settlers and officials. Reading these responses alongside the archival record complicates the standard narrative of railway-driven progress by showing how the tracks brought both coercion and contested possibilities. The railway was an instrument of empire, but it moved through living territories, and those territories shaped how dispossession unfolded. Maps and surveys, visual erasure of indigenous lands and claims. Think of maps and surveys as an iron grid placed over a living quilt. The quilt is made of trails, seasonal camps, sacred sites, hunting grounds, and stories stitched across generations. Survey lines, townships, and section grids did not simply describe the land. They cut it into standardized pieces that fit a colonial economy. Once the grid was drawn, the quilt's patterns were harder to see. Railway companies and land offices used those rectangles to allocate land to settlers and to quantify territory for the state, making indigenous relationships with land invisible on official papers. Maps work like an instrument of legibility, not like a neutral picture. They translate complex, overlapping uses of land into categories the colonial state could manage, tax, and transfer. The Dominion Land Survey, for example, imposed a checkerboard that attended railway corridors and settler lots, while surveyors named rivers, lakes, and hills after politicians and engineers. Missionary letters and survey journals show how place names were recorded, altered, or erased in the same breath as promises about progress. Oral testimony makes plain that these decisions mattered on the ground, because a name or a lot line could change who had access to water, grazing, or burial places. Surveying was a legal act as much as a technical one. A survey plan filed with a land registry became evidence of title, and titles were the currency of settlement and capital. Treaties and reserve boundaries were often reconciled to the same mapping regimes, folding indigenous claims into the same kinds of paper spaces used to sell town sites along the rail. When promises in treaty text conflicted with survey maps, officials routinely treated the map as authoritative. That turned moments of negotiation into later disputes, because a line on a plan could override an oral promise recorded in indigenous testimony. Maps were not uncontested. Indigenous communities produced countermaps, place name lists, and testimony to challenge official versions. These materials survived in song, story, and later legal affidavits, offering different logics of space that emphasized use, relationship, and kinship ties over geometric parcels. In court records and commission hearings, those oral geographies sometimes forced revision or compensation. More often, however, the official map held the day, because colonial power rested on the capacity to make the landscape legible to bureaucrats, surveyors, and investors. The visual erasure worked with material practices. Survey camps, stakes, cleared lines of sight, and temporary depots physically transformed the terrain and signaled state intent to outsiders. Railway placement frequently determined where roads would go, where town sites would be platted, and where reserves would be confined. Missionary correspondence and land office memos reveal a steady, practical choreography. Lay track, survey adjacent lands, proclaim townships, allocate lots, sell patents. Each step made indigenous dispossession more durable because it was documented, recorded, and monetized. This is why returning to maps matters for history and law. Reading survey plans alongside oral histories, mission letters, and treaty texts exposes how the quilt of indigenous life was overlaid by another pattern, one designed for extraction and settlement. The grid can be unstitched in narrative, and countermapping can reweave lost place names and uses into public record. A map is powerful because it persuades, but it is not an act of nature. It is a choice, and choices can be documented, contested, and sometimes corrected. Engineering, expropriation, and everyday mechanisms of dispossession. Railway engineering was not only a technical undertaking, it was a legal and political operation that remade property relations on the ground. Building track required continuous swaths of cleared land for the right-of-way, stations, sidings, and approaches. Governments empowered railway companies to expropriate private and communal lands through statutes that prioritized public utility, language that often meant settler and corporate needs trumped indigenous occupation. Surveyors walked these corridors with chain and compass, converting lived landscapes into linear assets that could be sold, mortgaged, and taxed. The physical act of grading a bed, blasting a cut, or filling a marsh had predictable legal consequences. Once a parcel was annexed to railway use, adjacent lands were often declared more valuable for settlement, and therefore targeted for sale or appropriation. In practice, engineering plans functioned as blueprints for dispossession, because each structural decision produced new legal justifications for land transfer. Quick emphasis point: engineering choices created legal facts. A surveyed right-of-way could extinguish traditional access even if the underlying title remained contested. Beyond track corridors, auxiliary infrastructure multiplied land takings. Stations required yards and warehouses, bridges needed approaches that altered riverbanks, and maintenance facilities consumed large lots for coal, timber, and water storage. Town sites were platted beside depots, often on land expropriated or obtained through speculative deals tied to the railway company. These nascent towns reshaped trading networks, redirecting indigenous trade and travel toward cash economies centered on the railway. The combined footprint of rails, towns, and support infrastructure therefore fractured seasonal rounds, disrupted access to fisheries and hunting grounds, and placed new physical obstacles across traditional pathways. Material interventions were double acts. They changed the terrain and they changed the rules that governed who could use that terrain. Quick emphasis point: small support structures had outsized effects. A single bridge or station could reroute an entire community's economy. The legal tools of expropriation were dress rehearsed in statutes, sometimes vague in wording, often generous in scope for corporations. Compensation systems prioritized market value, ignoring communal or spiritual losses that could not be priced. Treaty negotiations and reserve relocations were frequently performed after surveys had established railway alignments, placing indigenous leaders on the defensive. Where legal recourse existed, it required navigating courts and commissions that privileged documentary evidence, especially survey plans and engineering reports. Oral testimony about use and sacred sites struggled to hold equal sway in these forums. The result was a legal architecture that converted engineering certainty into dispossession, because technical plans became decisive proof of entitlement. Quick emphasis point: courts loved maps. Engineering plans often did more work in law than human witnesses. On the ground, railway camps and their social ecologies intensified dispossession through demographic and environmental change. Temporary camps swelled into permanent settlements, bringing wage labor, alcohol, and new market pressures. Timber and water extraction for construction strained local resources, sometimes destroying berry patches, spawning erosion, and altering fish runs. Indigenous people who engaged in wage labor or trade with camps found new dependencies, which altered household economies and sometimes undermined traditional governance. Violence and policing accompanied these shifts, as rules around trespass and surveillance hardened around the tracks and town sites. Engineering thus produced not only legal exclusion but daily practices of control that reshaped relationships to land and community life. Quick emphasis point: camps were catalysts, not merely backdrops. Their economic and social footprints outlived the temporary workforce. Resistance and adaptation emerged alongside these processes, often in ways that responded directly to engineering forms. Communities contested survey lines, produced countermaps, and used injunctions or blockades to delay construction. Where displacement occurred, leaders negotiated for reserves, water rights, or cash payments tied to the railway corridor, trying to create durable buffers against further incursions. Religious and educational institutions sometimes mediated these deals, complicating agency with paternalism. The record shows a mixture of tactical accommodation and principled refusal, strategies calibrated to differing capacities and objectives. Reading engineering plans alongside oral histories reveals how technical choices were met with political responses and how the tracks became both sites of dispossession and of contested authority. Quick emphasis point: engineering met politics. Technical decisions spawned legal fights, negotiations, and ongoing forms of resistance. Chapter 2: Treaties on the Record and Off the Record. Railways moved faster than treaty processes. In one documented case, survey crews laid out a proposed right-of-way and staked townsite lots within weeks of a provisional agreement, long before a treaty commission had finished consulting local families. That speed was not accidental. Governments and railway companies operated to timetables measured in months and seasons, not in the years it often took indigenous communities to deliberate, consult kin, and reach collective decisions. The result was a collision of tempos, with profound consequences for who could shape the terms of land cession. This chapter examines that collision. It looks at how railway timetables compressed treaty timelines, creating situations where negotiation took place in the shadow of track-laying crews, not in the open light of thoughtful consultation. Using treaty texts, missionary correspondence, survey journals, and oral testimony recorded both at the time and decades later, we trace moments when urgency was used as leverage. Officials framed rapid agreements as inevitabilities, invoking freight schedules, military mobility, and settler expectations to justify pressured signings and provisional arrangements that later hardened into legal facts. Urgency was a political tool. Railway schedules gave governments a story they could tell, namely that opening a corridor was essential to the public good. That narrative carried weight in courts and in public opinion, because timetables suggested fixed needs, not negotiable possibilities. When indigenous leaders asked for time, for reserves mapped to seasonal use, or for compensation that recognized communal loss, they were frequently told the train could not wait. This chapter shows how that language of necessity mattered in law, because procedural shortcuts, provisional orders, and expedited surveys produced documentary records that favored state and corporate claims. At the same time, urgency altered indigenous strategies. Oral histories recount how communities reoriented decision-making under pressure, sometimes accelerating internal consultation, sometimes choosing to delay formal acceptance while contesting practical intrusions. In other cases, leaders secured specific protections precisely because they recognized the leverage the railway timetable provided. They used the very deadlines that threatened them to extract promises on reserve locations, access routes, or hunting rights. These episodes complicate any simple portrayal of indigenous people as passive victims of haste. They demonstrate tactical agency within constrained circumstances. Legal analysis helps explain why timing mattered beyond the moment of signature. Courts and commissions privileged contemporaneous documents, survey plans, correspondence that noted urgency, and commissioners' reports. When disputes later reached adjudication, the archival record often reflected the projective certainty of railway schedules, making it easier to justify expropriations or deny claims about procedural impropriety. This chapter follows those paper trails, showing how the temporal architecture of colonial administration, its calendars, deadlines, and fiscal years, became an instrument of dispossession. Reading timelines side by side, the chapter asks us to rethink what a treaty signing meant in a context of scheduled construction. Was consent freely given, or was it coerced by the pressure of imminent rails and rolling stock? How do oral accounts that describe hurried meetings square with neat signatures in the record? By keeping indigenous voices at the center, and by juxtaposing legal documents with lived testimony, we reveal how speed functioned as a technique of colonial expansion, even as communities fought to bend clocks and timetables to their own needs. Written clauses versus oral promises, conflicting records, conflicting rights. Written treaty clauses often read like tidy contracts, enumerating reserves, annuities, and surrender language. Oral promises, recorded in letters, meeting notes, or remembered in community testimony, frequently added layers of meaning that are absent from the written text. Missionaries, interpreters, and Indian agents sometimes relayed assurances about hunting access, spiritual protections, or flexible boundaries that never made it into the printed agreement. The result is a persistent tension where two overlapping archives claim authority, each shaping rights in different ways. Quick emphasis. Courts have tended to prefer the tangible written record, but lived rights often track the oral promises people relied on. That disjunction drives many modern land claims. A less-known pattern is how officials deliberately used ambiguous phrasing to leave room for verbal clarification, while later denying that clarification ever occurred. Commissioners would frame clauses broadly, saying details would be settled locally or subject to understanding, then rely on the written document to foreclose later disputes. This procedural ambiguity gave officials plausible deniability, converting flexible, negotiated understandings into rigid legal text once political needs shifted. Indigenous delegations recalled precisely how chiefs were told that seasonal use and access routes would be respected, memories that survive in community law and song. Quick emphasis. Ambiguity in wording was not accidental. It was a political tactic that shifted power into document form. That shift favored the settler state over oral-based decision-making. Oral histories reveal promises about compensation and community rights that appear nowhere in treaty books, but appear repeatedly in missionary diaries and interpreter journals. These off-the-record assurances were often delivered in the vernacular and framed in cultural logic that did not map neatly onto European legal forms. For example, promises about shared river access or ceremonial sites were described in relational terms, not as parcels to be surveyed. When surveyors later imposed a grid, those relational claims were fractured, leaving profound social and spiritual loss that the written clauses failed to acknowledge. Quick emphasis. Cultural mismatch in communication forms amplified dispossession. Archival silence on relational rights is itself evidence of erasure. Legal analysis shows why this conflict matters today. Courts sometimes accept oral testimony about promises, but only when that testimony can overcome the weight of contemporaneous written records and official minutes. Judges ask for consistency, corroboration, and timing, standards that privilege archival fragments over communal memory. That does not mean oral promises are without weight, but it explains why many indigenous groups have pursued statutory and treaty interpretation strategies that press for a living liberty principle, a legal doctrine that respects the spirit and intent of agreements. Quick emphasis. Winning recognition for oral promises requires translating relational, temporal understandings into legal arguments the court system can digest. That is a high, often unfair burden. A fresh insight emerges when we view oral promises as parallel legal orders, not merely informal extras. Indigenous legal traditions treated spoken commitments as binding in communal law, often enforceable through ceremony and kinship accountability. When colonial agents ignored those forms, they did not simply lose a line in a document, they undermined an entire system of governance that regulated land, reciprocity, and stewardship. Recognizing this helps explain why remedies that only restore acreage or money feel insufficient to communities whose losses were social and spiritual as well as material. Quick emphasis. Treating oral promises as part of a plural legal landscape reframes remedy, moving beyond acreage to restoration of governance and relationships. Practically, historians and litigants can strengthen claims by building records that join documentary traces with oral testimony, missionary notes, and landscape evidence, such as traditional place names and disrupted resource sites. This integrative approach has succeeded in several recent decisions and in negotiated agreements where governments accepted negotiated understandings as operative law. The work is painstaking because it requires validating different kinds of evidence against institutional standards that were designed to exclude them, but it also models how a more honest accounting of treaty history might proceed. Quick emphasis. Combining archives and oral witness is slow but effective. It shows a path toward recognizing the full range of promises that shaped indigenous expectations. Letters, agents, and coercion, administrative practices that produced dispossession. Bureaucratic paperwork framed the railway era, and those papers were not neutral. Indian agents, commissioners, and clerks translated complex living negotiations into forms designed for storage and control. Letters between agents in Ottawa show a pattern: urgency about land clearances, repeated requests for instructions, and an eagerness to close files. That administrative hunger for closure shaped action on the ground, incentivizing quick surveys, compressed treaty sittings, and categorical answers to questions that required nuance. The formality of correspondence turned conversation into a set of yes or no choices, and those choices often favored railroad schedules over indigenous deliberation. Quick emphasis. Paperwork did not simply record events, it made them. Administrative rhythms privileged efficiency over consent. Indian agents occupied a fraught middle space, both intermediaries and instruments of state power. Some agents advocated for indigenous rights, pleading for fair reserves or delayed relocation. Others acted as gatekeepers of assimilation policy, enforcing schooling, rations, and surrender documents. Their letters to superiors reveal how discretionary power was wielded. Small choices about when to call a council, whether to permit interpreters, or how to phrase an option, all produced outsized consequences. Because agents controlled access to the administrative record, they could quietly omit promises made orally or note them in private journal entries that never survived official transcription. Quick emphasis. The agent's pen could erase a promise or make it invisible to future courts. Coercion was not always violent or dramatic. It was administrative and spatial. Threats of withheld rations, delayed annuities, or denial of pass permits pressured chief and community councils to accept quick settlements. Railway companies coordinated with Indian Affairs to set deadlines, promising jobs or supplies if land was surrendered promptly. The result was a negotiation context where refusals carried tangible costs. Oral testimony collected later in communities often remembers these pressures as a constant background presence, a structural force that shaped the terms of consent even when no single act of physical coercion occurred. Quick emphasis. Coercion operated through dependency and timing, not only through threats or force. Letters also reveal tactics of legal containment. Officials framed agreements in language meant to limit future interpretation, using phrases like subject to survey or for reserve purposes, then relying on technical survey plans to narrow rights. Clerks instructed surveyors to place reserve corners where they minimized interference with future railway sidings or agricultural lots. Missionaries and interpreters sometimes warned that such placements would sever traditional travel routes, but technical reports carried the day. When disputes later emerged, courts relied on the precise bearings and lot lines produced by survey teams, not on the situational warnings that circulated in correspondence. Quick emphasis: technical precision in surveys translated into legal precision that favored the settler economy. An illustrative case comes from a prairie community where a missionary noted in a private diary that local elders were promised continued river access for fisheries. The Indian agent wrote a routine dispatch recommending a smaller reserve near the train line to ease administrative delivery, and the surveyor drew straight lines that ignored seasonal camps upstream. Decades later, when the community sought legal recognition of its fishery rights, judges examined the reserve plan and the agent's dispatch, but the missionary diary and elder's testimony were sidelined as inconsistent. The archival trail shows how ordinary administrative choices, recorded as routine files, produced a durable pattern of dispossession that was hard to reverse. Quick emphasis: small administrative decisions accumulate into large injustices, visible only when records are read together. Corrective legal strategies today build precisely on that integrated reading of files, combining letters, diaries, oral histories, and landscape evidence. Claimants and their lawyers assemble the private and public traces to show that promises existed, were relied upon, and were frustrated by administrative practice. This work reframes correspondence not as neutral evidence, but as an arena where power was exercised and resisted, a space where the state made dispossession legible and enforceable. Recognizing the administrative production of dispossession shifts responsibility from isolated bad actors to institutional routines that remain relevant in contemporary treaty justice. Chapter 3: Oral Histories, Memory, and the Railway's Reach. When the first rails crept through a valley, the official account often marked a line on a map and recorded a grant, a station, a surveyed right-of-way. Those papers mattered, but they left out a different geography, one made of seasonal trails, winter camps, berry patches, and river mouths. This chapter turns to those places, to the stories that survive in voices and memory, to show how the railway altered landscapes that maps could not capture. Hidden landscapes, oral histories of disrupted routes, camps, and seasonal resources, names what the archive tends to ignore and explains why those omissions matter for law and justice today. I begin with a short story from a woman in her 80s, recorded in a community interview in the 1990s. She described a childhood morning when the roar of a new freight train made elders stand and count the breaths of the river, because the smoke had chased away the geese that always signaled the start of the spring hunt. That single memory connects a sound to food security, social ritual, and seasonal timing. It is not an anecdote about property lines. It is testimony about a living calendar that railways silently rewrote. When legal records set boundaries by bearings and lots, they rarely reflected the calendar her family used to organize life. Oral histories do more than fill gaps. They reveal how people navigated dispossession, how families rerouted travel, how harvest sites were abandoned and later returned to in secret. These narratives surface the micro-practices of survival: walking around a culvert to reach a berry patch, setting fish nets at a new channel formed by embankment runoff, turning a former campsite into a winter school. Such adaptations show agency, not merely loss. Yet they also testify to trauma and constraint, because adaptation often meant shrinking options and accepting permanent changes to subsistence patterns. Listening to these stories requires method. Oral testimony is not a substitute for written records, nor is it simply sentimental memory. It is evidence with its own internal logic and standards of reliability. In this chapter, I describe how interviews were conducted, how memory was cross-checked with mission diaries, survey plans, and environmental data, and how legal practitioners have used oral histories to reopen treaty obligations. The goal is practical: to show how testimony about lost routes, camps, and seasonal resources can be translated into forms that courts and tribunals can weigh alongside maps and ledgers. Memory also unsettles timelines. Official narratives often present the railway as an event, a moment of construction that created a new order. Oral accounts reveal a process, one that unfolded over years and generations. People measured change by the cycles of the land. A trail that was passable in snow and impassable after an embankment, a berry run that dwindled over a decade, a spawning ground that shifted after channeling. These were temporal shifts that mattered in everyday life, and they complicate any neat cause and effect story about dispossession. Finally, centering these voices reframes responsibility. If dispossession looks different when we include hidden landscapes, then remedies must also change. Legal and policy responses that focus solely on reserve sizes or monetary compensation miss contiguous harms to mobility, to food sovereignty, and to ceremonial practice. By tracing how railways unmade seasonal patterns and rerouted social life, this chapter argues for reparative measures that recognize the full scale of loss and for listening as a method of justice, not merely as a source of color for archival narratives. Ethics and practice, centering community-controlled oral testimony in railway research. Ethics in railway research cannot be an afterthought, it must be the foundation. Community-controlled oral testimony means that Indigenous communities set the terms for how interviews are requested, recorded, stored, interpreted, and shared. This begins with consent that is ongoing, not a one-time signature. Researchers should prepare clear, plain-language agreements that specify ownership, access rights, and conditions for use, and those agreements must be negotiable and revisable as community needs change. Practically, this requires time and funds in project budgets for community meetings, translation, and legal review. Emphasis: consent is a process. Budgets and timelines must reflect that reality. Data sovereignty frameworks provide practical tools for asserting community control. In Canada, the OCAP principles, ownership, control, access, possession, are widely used, alongside broader movements for Indigenous data sovereignty and UNDRIP obligations. These frameworks shift the default away from institutional custody of materials toward community-held archives, whether physical or digital. A less-known innovation is community-led digital repositories that grant tiered access, combining local stewardship with curated research access for scholars under agreed terms. Those repositories can include metadata standards that make provenance and consent traceable, improving both ethics and evidentiary value. Emphasis: technical systems can embody ethical commitments, making provenance visible and enforceable. Method matters as much as legal form. Training and remunerating community members as interviewers and co-researchers changes the power dynamics of evidence production. When elders speak to a familiar listener, narratives are richer and more nuanced, and the resulting testimony is more defensible in court because it reflects customary modes of sharing knowledge. Researchers should offer capacity building so communities can manage transcription, translation, and annotation in ways that preserve cultural meaning. Equally important is respecting refusal, silence, and redaction, recognizing that withholding a memory can itself be an act of protection. Emphasis: community researchers transform quality and legitimacy of testimony. Translation and contextualization are often overlooked, but they determine whether oral histories travel intact into legal and policy arenas. Literal translations erase embedded terms about seasonality, kin obligations, and ritual land use, producing legal records that do not match lived practice. Investing in annotated translations, glossaries, and audiovisual supplements helps courts and officials understand the cultural logic behind statements. Another underused practice is ceremonial authentication, where communities formally attest to the provenance and meaning of testimony, providing a culturally grounded corroboration that legal systems can be taught to respect. Emphasis: accurate translation preserves legal and cultural meaning. Finally, researchers must plan for long-term stewardship and reparative outcomes. Community-controlled archives should include options for repatriation, embargo, and eventual destruction if that is the community's wish. Agreements should also outline benefit sharing, whether through employment, capacity building, public education materials, or legal support for land claims. Treating oral testimony as living, governed material changes how railway history is written, shifting it from extraction to partnership, and producing records that communities can use to assert rights, heal, and remember. Emphasis: ethical practice links documentation to tangible community benefits. Chapter 4: Resistance, Negotiation, and Everyday Adaptation. When rails arrived on the edges of indigenous territories, they did not meet only empty land. They met people who had lived, moved, and governed those places for generations. Those encounters produced a wide range of responses, from formal petitions to armed blockades, from courtroom claims to quiet everyday strategies that kept families fed and ceremonies alive. This chapter follows those responses, not as isolated acts, but as parts of a sustained political life shaped by law, time pressure, and the material realities of dispossession. I draw on treaty records, missionary correspondence, community interviews, and court files to show how resistance, negotiation, and adaptation were intertwined tactics of survival. Direct resistance, blockades, petitions, and the costs of confrontation. That phrase names a cluster of tactics that recur across time. Petitioning was often the first formal step. Letters and memorials sent up bureaucratic chains, recorded in agent reports and sometimes ignored. When petitions failed, communities turned to more visible forms of refusal. Blockades of track and siding recurred in the 20th and 21st centuries, and they did not appear out of nowhere. They were grounded in histories of broken promises, recorded in treaties and in oral testimony about lost hunting grounds and ruined fisheries. The record shows both the clarity of the grievances and the heavy consequences for those who stepped into confrontation. An archival snapshot from the 1880s conveys the pattern. A band council sent a detailed petition describing how survey crews cut through fall camps and how buffalo drives were disrupted by survey stakes and grader work. The Indian agent's reply, kept in a departmental file, promised an inquiry that never materialized. Oral testimony collected many decades later recounts those same stakes as markers of rupture and remembers elders who rerouted winter trails to avoid the tracks. Together, those sources reveal a common sequence: formal complaint, institutional delay, growing desperation, and then escalated action when official channels had run out. The modern record gives a more immediate illustration. In 2019, coordinated blockades of rail lines occurred in multiple provinces in solidarity with hereditary chiefs resisting pipeline construction. Those actions halted passenger and freight service, drew national attention, and forced rapid political responses. They also brought arrests, charges, and long-term legal battles. The blockades exemplify the costs of confrontation, costs borne most heavily by community members who risked criminalization, economic hardship, and state force to protect land and law. At the same time, they show how direct action can force public scrutiny of legal and policy failures that would otherwise remain obscure. Resistance was rarely only confrontation. Negotiation often took place parallel to protests, shaped by timelines set by rail companies and government officials. Negotiated settlements were constrained by deadlines, by the need to keep construction on schedule, and by the power of those who controlled access to economic resources. Oral histories make clear that negotiations sometimes yielded small gains, such as modified rights-of-way or promises of employment, but these were frequently partial, contingent, and hard to enforce. Legal analysis in this chapter explains why written assurances and verbal commitments diverged, and why courts often privileged documentary records over embodied testimony. Not all adaptation looked like resistance or negotiation. Everyday adaptation was quieter, shaped by shifting harvest patterns, new seasonal calendars, and creative legal strategies such as guardianship claims and land use protocols. These responses are political acts in their own right, forms of continuity under pressure. By tracing the full spectrum from blockades to petitions to day-to-day survival, this chapter places agency at the center of the railway story. It argues that understanding dispossession requires seeing how communities resisted, compromised, and reimagined life along the tracks. Negotiation, everyday adaptation, and paths to strategic agency. Think of indigenous responses to the railway as a braided river, where several streams run together and apart, each with its own current but all shaping the same landscape. One stream is formal negotiation, conducted at treaty tables, in agent offices, and later in courtrooms. Another stream is everyday adaptation, the quiet rerouting of trails, the shifting of seasonal camps, the rearrangement of household economies. A third stream is strategic agency, deliberate choices to use law, media, or alliances to change power dynamics. Reading these streams together helps us see that resistance was rarely one thing. It was a set of overlapping practices that communities combined depending on opportunity, urgency, and values. Negotiation often arrived under tight schedules, with rail timetables setting the tempo. Officials in railway companies controlled deadlines, land surveys, and payment schemes, which compressed deliberation and favored scripted agreements. Treaty texts and departmental correspondence show how negotiators framed options limited by the need to keep construction moving, and mission letters record the pressure indigenous leaders felt as their winter survival cycles were disrupted. Oral histories reveal a parallel record, where elders recall agreeing to concessions to avoid immediate dispossession, while keeping in mind long-term survival. Negotiation, in practice, was bargaining under a clock, where time itself was a source of power for colonial actors. Everyday adaptation was the patient, adaptive work that kept communities intact while larger legal and political battles unfolded. People reoriented hunting routes around cut lines, moved seasonal camps to preserve access to fisheries, and altered food storage techniques to cope with changed landscapes. These practices show intimate landscape knowledge and a capacity to absorb shock without surrendering identity. Administrative reports often ignored these adjustments, treating them as private hardships, while oral testimony frames them as deliberate tactics of continuity. Everyday adaptation, then, was not resignation. It was a form of resistance that maintained social and spiritual life. Strategic agency emerged when communities translated everyday knowledge and negotiating experience into targeted political tools. Some used court litigation to test treaty language and secure precedent. Others formed co-management agreements to assert decision-making over resources, and still others crafted public campaigns to shift public opinion. Missionary and company records sometimes recorded surprise at indigenous legal sophistication, while modern legal analysis demonstrates how carefully framed claims could create openings in a hostile system. Strategic agency combined long-term planning with opportunistic moves, like a fisher waiting for the tide and choosing the moment to cast a net. Think of these options as braided strands that communities could weave in different patterns, depending on place and need. A band might simultaneously file a petition, reroute camps, and prepare a court case, each action supporting the others. This braided approach complicates narratives that separate resistance from adaptation, showing how survival strategies could be both immediate and anticipatory. It also explains why single victories or losses rarely tell the whole story, because the braid can be tightened or loosened across generations. Short emphasis: negotiation and adaptation reinforced each other. They were not opposites. Legal wins mattered, but so did the daily practices that sustained life between court dates. Short emphasis: strategic agency meant learning the rules of the settler system while refusing to be defined solely by them. Communities converted local knowledge into legal and political leverage, step by step. Chapter 5: Law, Courts, and the Aftermath of Broken Promises. Imagine opening a letter that promises you a plot of land, a livelihood, or a protected hunting ground, and finding later that the words were there on paper, but the reality has been reshaped by someone else's map. Many readers have felt that small shock at a broken promise, in family disputes, landlord conflicts, or bureaucratic delays. Now scale that shock up 100-fold to promises recorded in treaty texts and government correspondence, backed by statutes and corporate charters, and enforced by courts with the power to decide who stays and who must move. This chapter asks what happens when the law, the very tool meant to fix rights and responsibilities, becomes a principal mechanism of dispossession. Law did not simply describe what happened alongside the railway, it helped make it possible. Statutes created frameworks for land grants and corporate charters, turned private companies into quasi-public actors with extraordinary powers. Administrative rules set processes for reserve creation, compensation, and expropriation that looked neutral on paper, but in practice privileged speed, certainty, and settler settlement over indigenous lifeways. This legal architecture provided both the blueprint and the justification for taking, altering, and reallocating land. Reading those statutes and charters alongside missionary reports, survey notes, and oral testimony exposes how formal rules were written into unequal futures. Courts entered the story where written words and lived promises diverged. Judges interpreted treaty language, administrative records, and company obligations to resolve disputes, often privileging documentary evidence over oral testimony. The result was not only legal loss, it was a reframing of memory and authority, where what was captured in ink gained permanence, and what existed in speech and seasonal practice became precarious. Yet that is not the whole story. Indigenous litigants, counsel, and communities used the same legal system tactically, testing precedents, pushing definitions, and winning constrained but important victories. Law could be a weapon, a shield, or a dead end, depending on timing, resources, and the persuasiveness of evidence. Administrative failures merit particular scrutiny. When bureaucracies delayed decisions, misfiled records, or refused to record oral assurances, those failures were not accidental. They followed routines that made dispossession administratively efficient and legally defensible. Letters between agents, the pacing of surveys, and the placement of reserve boundaries reveal a chain of everyday decisions that compounded into large-scale transfer of land. Tracing this chain shows how routine paperwork turned into structural harm, and how correcting an injustice requires more than a favorable court ruling. It requires restoring documents, memories, and access. This chapter combines archival digging with oral histories and legal analysis to map the afterlife of broken promises. We will examine key statutes and charters, follow the administrative practices that implemented them, and analyze landmark cases that shaped later claims. Along the way, we will listen to elders who remember the conversations that never made it into the file, and to counsel who litigated against powerful combinations of state and corporate interests. The intent is neither a legal brief nor a lament, but a clear account of how law produced dispossession and how communities have used law and other forms of strategic agency to press for redress. By the end, readers should see that courts and statutes were not neutral arbiters. They were active participants in the transformation of landscapes and lives. Understanding that legal architecture matters is essential if reconciliation is to move beyond rhetoric, and if remedies are to address the intertwined legacies of policy, paperwork, and broken promises. Courts, doctrines, and pivotal. Railway-era judgments courts played a central role in turning contested promises into settled law, often by choosing which kinds of evidence counted as authoritative. 19th-century judges tended to favor written instruments, maps, and company records produced by colonial administrations because they matched legal formalities that courts understood and trusted. Oral testimony, seasonal use patterns, and indigenous modes of land tenure rarely fit those formal categories, and so were treated as secondary or anecdotal. That evidentiary preference mattered in railway disputes because the tracks themselves generated voluminous paperwork: land grants, survey plans, expropriation notices, and corporate minutes. When courts accepted those documents as conclusive, they effectively for a particular version of events that favored state and corporate interests. Over time, that pattern produced a jurisprudence in which documentary certainty trumped lived practice. Quick emphasis: courts often functioned as ratifiers of administrative narratives, not neutral fact-finders. Documentary primacy became a structural barrier to indigenous claims. Several legal doctrines that emerged or hardened during the railway era deserve close attention, because they shaped outcomes long after tracks were laid. The doctrine of extinguishment by clear and plain intention placed the burden on those seeking to prove that indigenous title still existed, by requiring explicit legislative or executive acts to show it had been taken. The Crown prerogative and statutory powers of expropriation created legal routes for taking land for public works, language that courts interpreted broadly. At the same time, private railway charters conferred quasi-public authorities on companies, enabling them to rely on the courts to enforce expropriation and collect damages, while leaving communities with limited remedies. These doctrines combined to make dispossession legally efficient, because they translated political decisions into judicially enforceable rules. Quick emphasis: legal fictions about public purpose and extinguishment lowered the evidentiary bar for dispossession. railway charters operated as legal multipliers of state power. A less-known aspect is how courts treated surveying practice as a form of legal finality, not just technical description. Surveyors working for rail companies and government produced cadastral maps that courts often accepted as the authoritative representation of ownership and boundaries. That acceptance made surveying errors, omissions, and deliberate manipulations consequential in law. Oral histories and missionary letters that described different shorelines, camp locations, or trail corridors were sidelined because they did not conform to the standardized grid. Listening to elders alongside surveyors reveals how mapping practices translated local knowledges into zones of invisibility, and how those zones were then endorsed by judges. Recognizing surveying as a legal act, not merely a bureaucratic step, helps explain why correcting historical wrongs requires more than new legislation. It requires remaking evidentiary standards. Quick emphasis: treating maps as incontestable evidence made technical work into a form of adjudication. Remedial work must reckon with the legal weight given to past surveys. There were pivotal judgments that later opened avenues for contesting this documentary regime, even if those decisions came decades after railway construction. Courts eventually began to acknowledge that the Crown could owe fiduciary obligations to indigenous peoples, and that oral promises might carry legal weight when courts reassessed standards of proof and admissibility. That jurisprudential shift did not happen overnight, and it often depended on resource-rich litigants, sympathetic counsel, and careful presentation of oral histories alongside expert evidence. The important lesson is that the law is not monolithic. It evolves. Indigenous litigants and their legal teams learned to translate oral testimony into forms that courts could accept, using anthropology, historical documents, and new evidentiary strategies to challenge earlier rulings. Quick emphasis: later case law shows law can be redeployed to protect rights, but access to that avenue is uneven and costly. Strategic legal work requires translating community knowledge into court-ready evidence. Finally, the railway-era courtroom was also a theater of narrative control, where competing stories about legitimate use, development, and belonging were told. Judges shaped those narratives by privileging certain archives and silencing others, but indigenous people did not simply disappear from the record. Their resistance, petitions, and statements to agents are often scattered through administrative files, missionary journals, and oral repositories, and reading the record holistically reveals a richer contestation than single judgments might suggest. Understanding court decisions in context means tracing not only the opinions, but the files, the depositions, and the maps that produced them. This archival orientation opens a path for reparative work that is both legal and historical, insisting that remedies address the documentary infrastructure that made dispossession stick. Quick emphasis: narrative control in courtrooms had material effects on land and life. Repair requires both legal remedy and archival reconstruction. Beyond lawsuits, jurisdictional gaps, contemporary claims, and alternatives. Lawsuits matter, but they are an incomplete tool for addressing railway-era dispossession. Courts decide based on jurisdiction, standing, and remedies that fit within existing legal frameworks, which often do not align with the realities communities describe. Some claims run into procedural bars because they implicate overlapping powers. For example, when land seized for a federal railway intersects provincial property regimes or municipal planning rules. Even successful decisions can be narrow, awarding monetary compensation where communities seek land, or finding title without practical pathways to restoration. This mismatch means that many harms remain outside the reach of adversarial litigation. Quick emphasis: the legal system can clarify rights, but it does not automatically deliver the kinds of territorial and cultural remedies communities prioritize. Jurisdictional gaps are not abstract. They shape who can be heard and what can be fixed. A band may have responsible governance over reserve lands, yet the tracts and adjacent crown lands fall under provincial control, complicating negotiations and enforcement. These gaps are compounded by historical paperwork that assign different legal categories to land based on the needs of rail companies, not indigenous occupation. The result is fractured responsibility, where federal, provincial, municipal, and corporate actors each point to the other when obligations to consult, compensate, or remediate arise. Quick emphasis. Overlapping authority creates a vacuum of accountability that delays or denies meaningful redress. Contemporary claims take many forms beyond courtroom pleadings, and some communities have used them strategically. The 2014 Supreme Court recognition of Aboriginal title in Silcotin Nation of British Columbia opened doctrinal doors by confirming that title can cover large territories and bring substantive rights to control land use. Yet the decision also made clear that practical application depends on political will, resources, and negotiation. Many communities, therefore, combine litigation with political engagement, public advocacy, and targeted negotiations to translate legal victories into concrete outcomes. Quick emphasis. Court success is a lever, not a guarantee. It works best when paired with sustained political strategy. Practical alternatives include negotiated settlements, co-management agreements, and statutory reforms that reallocate decision-making power. Negotiated settlements can offer tailored remedies such as land transfers, priority access to resources, and shared governance of impacted corridors. Co-management creates institutional spaces where Indigenous law and state law interact, allowing local priorities to shape environmental stewardship, heritage protection, and economic development near rail lines. Statutory reforms, including clearer consultation duties and stronger protection for traditional use areas, reduce the need for repeated litigation. Quick emphasis. Institutional innovation can produce durable, locality-sensitive remedies that courts alone rarely provide. Community-driven processes also center Indigenous law as a source of remedy and legitimacy, reversing the evidentiary imbalance courts historically entrenched. Some First Nations and Métis governments have developed land codes, heritage laws, and consent protocols that assert internal jurisdiction over lands and practices disrupted by railway infrastructure. When these local rules are recognized by partners and funders, they become the basis for rehabilitation projects, cultural reclamation, and economic initiatives tied to affected landscapes. This approach requires state actors to accept plural legal orders and to negotiate in good faith, not merely to consult as a box-checking exercise. Quick emphasis. Recognizing Indigenous legal orders reframes remedies from compensation to restoration and self-determination. An anecdote helps make the stakes concrete. In a prairie community, elders testified that a seasonal berry site had been bisected by a rail embankment a century earlier, a detail missing from cadastral maps used in a court file. The band pursued compensation, but facing jurisdictional confusion and a narrow damages regime, the legal route stalled. The elders then narrated the place again in a community-led mapping project, secured a co-management agreement with the rail company, and obtained funding to restore trail access and plant native shrubs. The combined strategy restored use and memory in ways money alone could not. Quick emphasis. Repair that honors lived relationships to land often requires creative mixes of law, politics, and community practice. Chapter 6. Spiritual Landscapes Severed. Cultural and Environmental Impacts. When tracks were laid across river terraces and ridgelines, the workmen cataloged stone, timber, and grade. They rarely recorded prayers, seasonal camps, or the small cairns that marked graves. Yet those human marks mattered. This chapter follows the places that railway construction severed from Indigenous life, showing how burial grounds, vision quest sites, and the networks of trails and waterways that held memory and law were made invisible by earthworks, embankments, and bureaucratic filings. Drawing on missionary letters, company records, oral testimony, and court files, we trace how the material act of cutting a corridor for steel translated into spiritual and ecological rupture. The harm was not only legal, it was ontological. For many communities, one landscape can be the locus of history, law, and ceremony at once. Burial grounds hold social relations across generations. Vision quest sites are not merely individual experiences, but anchors for shared cosmologies and obligations. When a rail embankment bisected a river bend, it was not only salmon runs that were altered, it was the route by which stories, rights, and responsibilities traveled. I document how engineers measured right-of-way in chains and links, while elders measured the severing of relations in names and remembrances. A short scene captures the stakes. In the 1920s, elders of a coastal nation watched workers dynamite a point they identified as the place where a young ancestor had fasted and received a name used by that family for generations. Company logs mention rock removal, surveyors note a setback, and a missionary wrote of progress. The community accounts recount a rupture, a loss of access, and a change in how that name could be passed on. That single job report sits beside testimony given decades later, when descendants explained that the ceremony could not be performed in the same way because the landscape had been altered, the line of sight broken, and the plant medicines displaced. This chapter also interrogates the legal vocabulary that made these changes legible to the state, but not to the peoples whose laws were embedded in place. Burial grounds were sometimes acknowledged, yet recorded under narrow categories that prioritized property over persistent use. Vision quest places, with their ephemeral markers and seasonal footprints, were invisible to cadastral surveys. Courts and administrators relied on documentary proof that fit state formats, reinforcing evidentiary norms that disfavor oral mapping of sacred itineraries. I analyze how these procedural choices produced a pattern of dispossession and how contemporary jurisprudence is beginning, haltingly, to recognize different kinds of proof. Finally, the chapter centers resistance and repair. Communities confronted severance through ceremony, legal claims, and practical reclamation projects that restored access, rehabilitated sites, and retold histories. Some actions sought full legal protection for a site, others aimed at reweaving disrupted pathways across tracts with negotiated crossings, signage, and ecological restoration. These responses reveal a persistent logic. Where law and infrastructure cut, people reknit. By following the threads of testimony, archival silence, and legal doctrine, we show why any honest history of the railway must account for the spiritual landscapes it severed, and how redress requires more than fences or compensation. It requires the restoration of relationships. Ecologies unraveled, wildlife, waterways, livelihoods, and community revitalization. Think of the landscape as a stitched quilt, each panel a woven set of habitats, trails, and stories. When the railway was sewn through that quilt, the seam did more than carry trains. It tightened and sometimes tore the fabric. Tracks sliced wildlife corridors, embankments altered water flows, and ballast and fill changed plant communities. For people whose law and memory are tied to specific panels, these changes made some patterns unreadable, undermining knowledge systems that guided hunting, fishing, and ceremony. Quick emphasis point. The railway acted like a literal seam that altered how pieces of the landscape connect, not just a line on a map. Wildlife losses were both immediate and cumulative. Beaver ponds were drained when culverts failed or were omitted. Riparian shade disappeared as embankments removed tall trees, and predator and prey movements shifted where underpasses or breaks in the line did not exist. Hunters and fishers recorded fewer moose and less predictable salmon runs. Observations later echoed in government wildlife reports and company mitigation files. Oral histories show these were not isolated events. They were changes that rewired seasonal calendars and subsistence routines. Quick emphasis point. Disruption to one species often jangled an entire food web, changing livelihoods and cultural rhythms. Waterways were especially vulnerable because tracks often followed river terraces and lowlands, places crucial for spawning, berry patches, and camping. Fill material elevated floodplain profiles, reducing overbank flooding that nourished wet meadows or forced rivers into new channels where ancestral fishing holes become inaccessible. Company logs that record drainage works sit beside elder testimony about lost eelgrass beds and altered eddies where nets once set. Courts and regulatory reviews tended to treat these as environmental impacts needing technical fixes, not as breaches of relational obligations embedded in place. Quick emphasis point. Altered hydrology translated into altered rights and relations, not only changed habitats. Livelihoods unraveled where landscapes no longer yielded what communities needed for food, medicines, and ceremony. Women and elders speak about fewer berries along former picking trails, children noting that riverbanks where they learned to fish have become unsafe. Some communities responded with creative adaptations, moving campsites, developing garden plots, or shifting harvest seasons, but these are repairs that often require new labor and new knowledge. Legal remedies have been uneven, with some settlements funding mitigation, while others leave communities to carry the cost of adaptation. Quick emphasis point: adaptation is not restitution, it is a labor of survival imposed on those who were harmed. Repair strategies offer a different logic, one that treats the quilt as mendable and communities as co-authors of the repair. Practical measures include restoring floodplain connectivity, installing culturally designed fish passages, and reopening traditional trails with safe crossings. Equally important are cultural stitches, such as ceremony to mark rehabilitated sites, community-led monitoring programs, and co-management agreements that give Indigenous governments real decision-making authority. These combined approaches show that ecological restoration without cultural revitalization is incomplete, and that durable repair must center Indigenous knowledge and consent. Quick emphasis point: effective restoration weaves ecological and cultural repair together, led by the communities most affected. Chapter 7, Archive, Evidence, and the Ethics of Storytelling. You have stood in a room full of boxes and felt a small, sharp thrill, imagining a long-buried truth waiting to be found. The paper smells of dust and glue, the cursive leans the way history leans, and for a moment the archive promises certainty. That feeling is real, and it is also dangerous. Archives are not neutral repositories of fact. They are shaped by choices about what to collect, preserve, and label. This chapter asks how those choices mattered for the railway story, and how reading those collections without care can reproduce the very silences we aim to correct. Reading against the grain is a method and an attitude. It means treating official records as partial accounts, paying attention to what is missing, and tracing the footprints of absent voices. In practice, that looks like cross-checking railway ledgers with band lists, comparing missionary correspondence to oral testimony, and following administrative routines that turned lived territories into line items. Doing this uncovers patterns of archival bias: whose words were recorded, whose were dismissed as informal, whose rights were documented in detail, and whose claims exist only in stories passed from elder to child. Bias in the archive has real consequences. Courts and governments treat written records as authoritative, which makes documentary asymmetry a legal problem as well as a historical one. When oral promises do not appear in treaty texts, when local land use is reduced to a checkbox, or when photographs frame Indigenous people as curiosities, those small acts of omission become obstacles in claims and negotiations. This chapter traces how documentary forms, not just overt policy, help normalize dispossession by making some claims legible and others invisible. Ethics is not an add-on, it is central. Gathering and quoting oral histories involves relationships, consent, and responsibility for future use. We show concrete practices that respect Indigenous data sovereignty: negotiated access to recordings, community review of transcripts, shared ownership of digitized materials, and co-designed research questions. These are not only moral imperatives, they produce better evidence. Community-controlled archives surface material that government files never captured, and they orient analysis toward community priorities rather than academic curiosity. The archive also contains acts of resistance: petitions, letters demanding fair treatment, stories saved in family Bibles, and maps drawn by people whose land was being taken. Reading these materials requires a forensic eye and a humility about the archive's limits. This chapter offers tools for that work, from close textual reading to triangulation with oral testimony, and from legal document analysis to logistical sleuthing that reconstructs who controlled time and resources in negotiations. Finally, this chapter argues that ethical historiography can change outcomes. When researchers and legal advocates present histories that center Indigenous testimony and procedural failures, they shift the evidentiary playing field. That does not erase the past, but it can open paths toward accountability and repair. What follows is a guide to uncovering silences, honoring stories, and building evidence that both recognizes the archive's power and refuses its complacency. Ethics and consent: respecting oral testimony and community authority. Oral testimony is not raw data waiting to be extracted, it is a living relationship. Consent must be negotiated not as a one-off formality, but as an ongoing conversation that recognizes changing needs and contexts. This means asking communities how they want stories recorded, stored, and shared, and respecting choices that limit access or delay publication. Researchers should budget time and resources for community review and accept edits, redactions, or withdrawals without pressure. Treating testimony as living material builds trust and produces more accurate histories. Consent can be conditional and revocable, and that reality matters legally and ethically. Many institutional consent forms assume permanence, which clashes with indigenous practices that allow stories to be recalled, recontextualized, or kept secret for generations. Agreements should include explicit provisions for revocation, timelines for review, and processes for dispute resolution. Acknowledging revocability affirms community authority and prevents later misuse of sensitive materials. Respecting revocation preserves dignity and prevents harm. A less known but powerful practice is negotiated metadata governance, which controls the labels attached to recordings and records. Metadata decides who can find a story, how it will be framed, and whether culturally sensitive terms are exposed to broad audiences. Communities often want granular control over descriptive fields, access tags, and public summaries, not only the files themselves. Giving communities the key to metadata is a practical way to stop misrepresentation and erase colonial cataloging practices. Digital repatriation, returning copies of digitized materials to community-controlled servers, changes the archive from a unilateral repository into a shared resource. This can include community-hosted databases, local language interfaces, or formats suitable for cultural protocol. Digital repatriation is not just about access. It is about shifting stewardship and decision-making authority to source communities. When communities control their materials, research becomes collaborative rather than extractive. Refusal is a legitimate research outcome and must be treated as such. When a community declines participation, that refusal holds important information about consent regimes, mistrust, or ongoing harm, and should be documented in respectful ways that do not reproduce the original harms. Researchers should report refusals without naming or shaming and use them to improve ethical protocols. Valuing refusal strengthens accountability and signals genuine respect for community autonomy. Ethical practice extends to legal use and public claims because courts and policymakers treat research as evidence. Communities must be part of decisions about whether testimonies can be used in litigation, policy advocacy, or media, and benefit-sharing agreements should account for potential legal outcomes. Researchers should explain possible legal trajectories in plain language and secure community approval for any use beyond the original research purpose. Clear, co-created terms reduce surprises and honor the authority of those whose stories make historical accountability possible. Chapter 8, Legacies, Reparations, and Paths Forward. Imagine driving along a straight ribbon of track, the landscape opening predictably on either side, mileposts ticking off progress. For many non-Indigenous Canadians, that image evokes national unity and economic growth. For the communities whose lands the tracks cut through, that same image can call up loss, disrupted lifeways, and unresolved promises. This chapter asks how those material scars from railway expansion have become living legal and political disputes, and how the fight for redress moves from landscape to courtroom and beyond. From tracks to courtrooms, railway-era breaches in modern land claims is not just a subtitle, it is a map of the book's argument. Railway construction generated concrete breaches of treaty and customary practice through land takings, coerced agreements, and mismatches between written texts and oral assurances. Those breaches did not evaporate when construction crews left. They were folded into administrative records, repeated in legal doctrines, and embedded in daily governance. Today, many of the largest and most consequential land claims trace their roots to decisions made in the narrow timeframes of railway planning and implementation. We draw evidence from multiple registers, treaty texts and government correspondence, missionary and company archives, and centrally, community testimony. Oral histories reveal the social and spiritual losses that paper records obscure, while legal analysis shows how courts and statutes have translated those historical acts into modern rights and remedies. Where archives create silences, testimony fills them. Where law creates barriers, community strategies reveal alternate pathways to recognition and material restoration. This chapter also treats reparations as both legal claims and moral projects. Reparations here mean more than money. They include land restoration, legal recognition, access to sacred sites, and institutional changes that prevent repetition. We examine successful and failed attempts at redress, from negotiated settlements and title litigation to public apologies and community-driven reclamation. Each case shows trade-offs, where immediate gains often come at the cost of broader rights, and where legal victories do not always deliver cultural or economic recovery. Finally, the chapter looks forward, offering practical frameworks for policymakers, lawyers, and communities. We highlight hybrid strategies that combine litigation, negotiation, and public advocacy, grounded in principles of consent and community authority. We argue that durable solutions require attention to ecological repair, cultural revitalization, and legal reforms that respect oral evidence and recognize historical context. The railway's tracks led to dispossession. The routes to justice must be mapped with equal care and with Indigenous agency at the center. Repair and co-governance, policy tools, reparations, and community-led restoration. Repair begins with recognition. For communities harmed by railway-era dispossession, meaningful reparations must acknowledge the layered harms, including lost territory, disrupted stewardship practices, and severed ceremonial landscapes. Policy tools that start from admission of harm tend to be more durable because acknowledgement reshapes the legal and political frame within which remedies are negotiated. Practical recognition can be statutory, such as formal findings of breach, or administrative, such as government protocols that accept oral histories as evidentiary foundations. Where recognition is absent, technical fixes like compensation payments risk becoming isolated gestures that do not restore relationships with land or law. Co-governance offers a pathway from recognition to practice. Co-governance is not a single model. It is a family of arrangements that share a core premise: power sharing in decision-making about territory and resources. Examples include cooperative management boards, delegated authority for resource licensing, and legally recognized Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Critical design elements determine whether co-governance works, including clear authorities, dispute resolution mechanisms, stable funding, and the capacity for Indigenous institutions to enforce rules. When these elements are missing, co-governance can reproduce paternalism by leaving final authority with the state, even as Indigenous partners perform day-to-day stewardship. Funding and capacity building are the linchpins of durable repair. Redirected financial resources enable communities to lead restoration, train guardians, and rebuild culturally specific governance institutions. Funding packages work best when they cover multi-year operational costs, not just one-time capital investment, because ecological and cultural repairs often take decades. Capacity building means more than training. It includes legal support for asserting Indigenous laws, archives, and language programs to reconnect knowledge systems, and infrastructure for community archives and monitoring. Without funding tied to Indigenous-defined outcomes, restoration projects may become constrained by externally imposed timelines and metrics. Legal reforms that valorize oral testimony and non-Western epistemologies change how claims are adjudicated and how remedies are framed. Courts and tribunals are beginning, in some jurisdictions, to accept oral histories as central evidence about land use, occupancy, and spiritual association. Policy can go further by creating administrative standards that require decision-makers to weigh oral evidence on equal footing with written records. Such reforms reduce the evidentiary asymmetry that long favored state records, and they open space for reparative remedies that align with community practices, such as returning specific tracts of land for ceremonial use instead of only providing cash. Quick emphasis point: reparation design must be community-led. External actors bring resources and tools, but legitimacy and effectiveness depend on Indigenous communities setting priorities and measures of success. Restoration practices often blend ecological science with Indigenous knowledge. Habitat reconstruction projects that integrate traditional burning regimes, riparian plantings, and controlled water flows show higher rates of ecological recovery and cultural renewal. Monitoring systems that involve community guardians produce better compliance and richer data because they track indicators that matter locally, not only those that fit external funding templates. These hybrid practices require flexible governance. where adaptive management replaces rigid, short-term project plans. Quick emphasis point. Co-governance without the tools to act is symbolic. Real power comes from legal authority, predictable funding, and processes that elevate Indigenous knowledge, not tuck it into advisory roles. Author's bio, Strikey Roy combines rigorous reporting with a lyric sensibility to illuminate stories of displacement, land, and memory. Drawing on years of close work with communities affected by social and economic upheaval, Roy writes with clarity, compassion, and a restless curiosity that turns small moments into powerful reckonings. When not writing, Roy leads community workshops, hunts down overlooked archives, and listens to train rhythms for the next line.